Note, the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of Three Gimbals. Hey everyone, I'm your host, Benjamin Butler, and I'd like to take this moment and welcome you back to Navigating Imbalance, a podcast by Three Gimbals. I am very, very excited for today's episode. I think there's going to be some great stuff discussed. I wanted to take a step away from some of the episodes we've been doing and turn our focus a little bit to something new, something exciting, something I think is really important. If this is your first time listening to this podcast, I think you came to the right place. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. With that said, I'd like to take a moment and ask our special guest today to introduce himself. Take it away.
Hi, my name is Kevin Modlin. I'm a professor at Western Kentucky University with emphasis in international affairs, where I have a PhD from Florida International University. My emphasis points especially around international affairs, national security, and specifically studying the language that countries use to define and characterize each other. And through those studies, I've been involved in the AI projects of late, and I know we'll dig into that specifically, Benjamin, but I look forward to riffing on global politics as well as AI.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Modlin, I should say, for appearing on this podcast. It's actually kind of crazy because we initially had a conversation during Soft Week, and I've had a lot of FIU guests on this podcast specifically, and it's been incredible just getting insights from them, specifically when we've gone into the deep dive of China and Chinese influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think that series of episodes that we've had on this show has been super successful so far. I know I've learned a lot, but when we connected, we were talking about all kinds of stuff, and you introduced to me this idea that you've created and brought to life, which is essentially an AI system that can replicate or respond as if it was Xi Jinping of China. So could you tell us a little bit about that? I was fascinated by it.
Yeah. So, thanks for mentioning the FIU background. Really benefited a lot from that education. I think many people from FIU benefit both from the theoretical foundations that they really drill into us and having a clear understanding as well as considering policy implications. So I think that's why it's part of our secret sauce, if you will. So within that, we really emphasize this idea of how language plays this intermediary role in state relations. How countries characterize each other is very significant. It's not necessarily, I know when I talk with many of my friends, we all say, oh, these politicians are just talking, right? They are talking, they talk a lot, but they are also trying to influence how society, including their rivals and opponents, see each other. And so it's not empty language. It has an effect, and sometimes it can be very significant effects, important signals of behavior, and so forth. So from that curiosity, works involved in gathering open source information and so forth to align AI models to specific figures. And as you mentioned, one of those is Xi Jinping. Next step is to build an ensemble that incorporates multiple aspects of the state that gives insight into their behavior. So a researcher would be able to query and interact with the leader. They could also interact with, say, a military or foreign ministry and see what the inner workings are and how they would respond to that, as well as opportunities to have the model interact with each other and get the process right and see how they may deliberate internally over certain questions. And again, this is all powered by open source information and refined by specialists. So I have the benefit of being able to talk to academic specialists in international affairs, national security, China, and so forth, to get their feedback to help make sure the model is accurately aligned to the subject matter. and that helps improve the model performance. So in the same sense that if I was building an AI aligned to law, which is a very effective business model and some very effective models out there, that I would want to bring in lawyers and add insight from them to make sure that the model aligns well. So AI models are excellent generalists, but this helps ensure that it is more closely set to that figure.
You're taking information from people who specialize in these fields and open source information and really using this to supercharge this AI model, which I think is unique because, full transparency, my background is primarily an all source analyst type background, primarily open source stuff that I've worked with. Looked at a lot of articles, a lot of news, a lot of use commercial tools to gather data in the open source realm. But one thing that I think a lot of the time there's difficulty when you're conducting open source analysis when it comes to analyzing political posturing and statements. To your point, I think that it's easy to dismiss a lot of statements made by politicians as oh well, they're just talking, or they're just saying this, they're bluffing, or they're lying about something. But I think the more difficult part is taking that a step further and asking, okay, well, why? Or what is it that they're trying, what's the underlying message that they're trying to get across? Is that message directed externally? Is it directed internally? Are they saying anything? Can I read between the lines? Are they saying anything else? Et cetera, et cetera. You know, the possibilities are endless there. But I think that what you're talking about and creating this suite of AI-based models could have real value for analysts all over the world in a number of different spheres, whether you're looking at politics specifically, whether you're more military adjacent, or anything else.
Yeah. Thank you. I think there is potential with that, and you're hitting at among many of the challenges that we have in international affairs in general, and it's all inferring. How do we understand and know each other, and particularly when an actor may have various audiences, as you referred to? What we're trying to do by having these ensemble approaches is the different aspects or the different models will incorporate different types of data. And that way we will be able to see kind of behind the lens specifically. So for example, the model that I've built of Xi Jinping is all based on his statements and Western news. So it does not include party doctrine or party statements. I think those insights are incredibly important. So we will build a specific ensemble model of basically CCP language, CCP doctrine, and documents over history, right? I think that is a critical component. But by segmenting that means that I'm not trying to over-infer from these different crossed information points. We also make a point of actually not including social media. And it's not because we don't use social media, obviously. It's a way of making sure that the model is aligned for specific purposes and not just dumping data in. If we dump in so much data in that way, we actually run the opposite problem. Then it becomes more of a generalist, like the base model would be. So all of these components are very important, but what we're focusing on is actually making sure that the model is aligned to that figure.
Right. So it's taking a surgical approach to creating a model as opposed to a shotgun approach of I'm just going to blast every piece of social media data, party line posts, everything about China I'm just going to throw into this model, which I think is kind of tempting. You know, in certain senses you're like, "Oh, well, if I want to know how this leader thinks, I need to include everything." But you're saying, no, let's create specific focused models for different purposes.
Absolutely. In the same way that, say, I have a friend who's a specialist in treating a specific disease, I don't want to dump all information at them. I want them to know the specific recent research related to that disease, right? That is the most important related information. Now, this does have one big drawback, is if there are countries and figures that elevate out of nowhere, as they say, or elevate and we don't have significant data on them, then it's very difficult to devise a model, at least at this time. I think there are a number of approaches. We could graph models or use synthetic data that could possibly get a good approximation. But specifically, this means that we do need reliable data to begin with.
Well, that makes sense. I appreciate the explanation, and I think that helps clear up some of the goal and the vision of what you're talking about in terms of creation of these models. Taking the conversation in a bit of a different direction now, expanding on some of it, shifting focus. We've seen the way in which we've shifted our focus as a nation away from some of the counterinsurgency, counterterrorism activities that we've been conducting at like a military operational level to now taking a step back and kind of re-engaging in a great powers competition, so to speak. We have conflict adjacent with Russia right now, obviously through the Ukrainian conflict. We have a brewing conflict with China on the horizon over Taiwan. And then that's not even to mention the statecraft that's going on behind the scenes, or not even really behind the scenes, but you've had India and Pakistan, the clashes that kind of just wrapped up, maybe. And then you have the deal that was just signed with Saudi Arabia. So I want to get your take on where do you see the great powers competition playing out in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And definitely everyone's going to have a slightly different perspective on this. And in some ways, it's not all that different from what we were just talking about with AI models. Basically, trying to understand the information and what is the most relevant information that we study, right? So that being specifically aligned in a model or for international affairs. And I like to step back and think about economic trends, economic conditions and patterns where each country is on those tracks, as well as technology development and resources and also other things like oil and things. So obviously China is part of this conversation. I think that this conversation does need to bring in a little dose of reality as far as how China's economy has been performing the last few years, right? So any type of a possible conflict would have to be an outgrowth of its economic performance. They've been more sluggish than in the last few decades. Is that going to continue as China focuses more and more on domestic consumption patterns and so forth? And of course, these trade disputes are affecting everybody, not just China, but that is a dimension to this conversation, but it's not the only one. I think that this pattern was developing with time. So I've shifted my outlook a little bit out of concern of the conflict and thinking that will go, if it happens, it happen a little bit later in that time horizon. That does not mean, though, that's more of a capability assessment. At the same time, the countries involved have high animosity with each other. It's increased significantly, and that does not help, obviously. I'm also uncertain on the Taiwan question. If China would invade Taiwan, I think they can have a huge effect on Taiwan's politics beyond a specific military operation, which would be highly risky to have that type of an invasion. So there's like different conditions within all these pieces that I am not certain about on that outlook. Specifically, what would the U.S. do? I think it's very clear that Trump has a different approach related to Taiwan than Biden did. Biden, for the first time, really changed the rhetoric around strategic ambiguity and had more declarative approach. It seems Trump is a little bit closer to ambiguity, but because of his non-committal approach in general, I think we have to put that somewhat close, at least, to the position on Taiwan. I don't think that he wants to signal otherwise because how that would affect relations with China. But I'm not convinced that we know how this will play out or any sense, but definitely the elevated power, the elevated rhetoric, definitely is reason for all of us to pay attention and why our forces are aligning closer to this great power competition. And of course, Russia is part of that conversation as well, as you mentioned. Um, I think Russia is definitely running into challenges, of course, on their own front, and I think they're going to try to continue to punch above their weight class. But because of the capability challenge, I think that will diminish their ability. But I think they'll still be a loud voice on the scene. And I think that there's a lot of things that are great puzzles with this. For example, why Russia hasn't committed more to the war, or why hasn't China assisted Russia more. And I think when we pay a lot of attention in global affairs to Russia and China and their relationship, we notice a lot when Putin and Xi meet, as they did recently. And what they often do, they talk about friendship, but friendships are superficial in international affairs. Everyone calls each other friends. How much are they willing to commit to each other? How many other populations black are they willing to commit to each other? Those are the big measurements as far as I'm concerned. And we don't see that. What we see mostly from Russia and China is that they articulate a similar vision of the world, specifically that they say that the world is multipolar. And that means that there are many powers in the world. So when they say that it's multipolar, they're, of course, including themselves in that conversation. But what's interesting is that characterization was in the 90s when it was not clear that they were part of that framework at all, right? That they were, Russia was coming out of the Cold War. China was just starting to really take off and grow. So that characterization has continued, but it's largely about seeing a similar image of that world, that there are powers in that space, that they have spheres of influence within that space, and they expect sovereignty to be recognized. There's a tension of that with the Western world. So I don't know if maybe I got into professor mode there for a minute. So
No. That's what I was looking for, because that actually raises a number of questions in my mind, and none of which I think necessarily can be answered definitively. But at the same time, like I spend time thinking about them because that's just what I do. But there, you hit a point that I wanted to kind of dig on a little bit more, which is the idea of a multipolar world. I've heard that language used now multiple times by mostly. I've been traditionally the last couple of years I've been focused more on Russia than I have on China, just due to the nature of my work and what pays the bills. But that may be changing in the future. That being said, I've heard it said by Russia multiple times. At BRICS conferences, you'll hear, it's a multipolar world. The days of U.S. hegemony are over. Spheres of influence, regional powers over world powers, etc. Do you think or why do you think that is fundamentally at odds with U.S. policy, and how do you think that will specifically play out? Do you think that the U.S. will allow that to take place in terms of spheres of influence, or do you think that we've already kind of made our position on that clear?
that's a great question. So I think it will be articulated for sure. And if it resonates is another question, or how long that sustains. It's also worth noticing that the talk about multipolarity can be very appealing to the developing world. So that is basically providing a counter framework from what the West is articulating, right? And that there's more of a space for some of these states to develop as they please. Usually, when the U.S. Engages in relations with others, there's some conditions around that, largely around rule of law, democracy that we all support. But Russia and China are comfortable with not having those conditions. But what's interesting is that commercial relationships develop other dependencies that these countries are now even more frustrated with than, frankly, if they talked with the West more. So there's a trade-off on that front. But it's an interesting question. Like, would these ideas be in friction with each other if they were not propagated by powers themselves? Right?
Right.
Is it language that is in tension on its own, or is it because we're in great competition? And I think the power competition is going to contextualize it the most. But I do think the language has some independent influences within it. In the same way that during the Cold War, with democracies articulating our vision and the Soviets articulating theirs, there was huge differences. Would these have been this pronounced without nuclear weapons and the threat of conflict? Probably not, but they are different ideas anyway. So,
Right. One thing that I've spent a lot of time focused on in this podcast has been Chinese influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. We've done multiple episodes, each taking a little bit of a deep dive on a specific country and Chinese influence operations, investments, economic policies within different places. But one thing, there's a common thread throughout all of that. And I can't help but wonder, do you view China's prolific ability to invest and build and develop a reliance on their technology infrastructure in these nations, do you view that as a failure of U.S. foreign policy in a way, opening the door to China, or do you view this as, hey, these countries just went with the better deal and what made sense, and it is what it is almost?
so yeah, there's some interesting points with that. I don't think so. Do we think that unipolarity was going to continue forever, or was it a moment? Right. So that was actually how it was characterized by like Krauthammer and others. That maybe this is just a moment, and what's interesting is that moment perpetuated for decades without competition in any significant way. China is, of course, investing in Latin America and Africa and parts of Asia. And as your podcast, strong podcast episodes really dive into, what I think that will continue and that will be part of the competition. But I also think that, again, because of China's slower growth and because a number of the Belt Road projects have not panned out the way they would like, this has a feedback loop to it. So both like expectations, how will this perform? But also they didn't generate the revenue they expected from a lot of these projects. So what do you get? What revenue, what money do you have to invest in next rounds of initiatives, right? So there's definitely a state interest that guides this, as well as just commercial interest. And you have to consider that over time, their expectation on more beneficial projects goes down on the list, right? It's not necessarily your best performing ones that are now being considered. So all of these taken together, I think that they will be investing in the aggregate less, but they will still be having effects in different regions. And I think it'll be very interesting how the U.S. counters that. And I think, frankly, the Trumpian approach, if you will, of being more direct and being more comfortable with commercial ties could challenge that in a different way in Latin America. There's a strong narrative, as your podcast talked about challenging Western or challenging the U.S. specifically. And I think that kind of gets melded into that, especially with the cycles of political actors in Latin America. So, but again, I think we have to look at China specifically and their economics cycles. And I think that will explain a lot more of the overall investments. They will invest some, but the aggregate amount, I think, could fall, actually. And I don't know if others expect that. That's my expectation.
Interesting. I hear that point, and I think of, some of the failures that some of the larger infrastructure projects that China's built in Latin America. I think of the Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam and the issues that it's had and the negative publicity that it's brought, the failures of, hey, they claimed that it was going to be able to do this and generate this amount of electricity, but it actually isn't. It's operating at 20% capacity because of droughts and all these other things which weren't factored into the building approach. So I definitely think there's an opportunity for the United States. I think it's going to be interesting to see what we choose to do, how we choose to try and capitalize on that. And I think it's hard to look at what has gone on in Latin America and think if we only had taken more action sooner, or if we hadn't neglected this area of the world. I don't know if that's even a fair statement to make, because I don't want to say we've neglected it per se, but sometimes I wonder, man, what were we thinking? How did this all come to happen? I read an article this morning that a coworker of mine sent in a group talking about how Chinese solar panel inverters have a backdoor that is they're able to essentially be controlled remotely and send information back to China. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, we're now just discovering all these things. How was it that for the 10 or 15 years that this has been going on, we haven't seen that, and then now all these things are coming to light? It's almost unbelievable.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I also think that this, I know a lot of people, including at FIU, are thinking about how a Latin America policy could shift, how it could be articulated. For example, Secretary Rubio has a long history of relations in Latin America and articulated policy. So I think that could be really interesting, but also just as a contrast to China's efforts, right? So what should you do if China's approaches have been very overt and been seen as a challenge to the United States, but they've been a mixed bag, right? So these infrastructure ideas that we're discussing, should the West go in and do those? Maybe the West was World Bank and others were saying, we're not going to get into this. This may be not a beneficial project to begin with. And that's why it was attractive to China. Well, maybe there's underlying reasons for that sometimes, right? So whether it be environmental conversations or just difficulty of building some infrastructure, or you would consider alternatives. And I think, frankly, that this may be a different way to think about aid as well. So many initiatives are focused on infrastructure. And of course, infrastructure matters. And as a Kentuckian, I benefit a lot from TVA and another all range of infrastructure. But I think that we have the potential with technology to bypass some of those limitations and get people connected within the marketplace even better. So I think it'd be interesting to think of more approaches like that than the infrastructure that may or may not work, right? So if you invest in young, innovative people, regardless of what country they are in, you're probably going to have upside for your country.
Yeah. I think that's a good point, and one that's not often talked about when we talk about investment, when we talk about aid. It's always the physical creation of things or places or roads, which are very important, but what are we doing, like what's the goal beyond just the physical creation of things? And I think, yeah, to your point, technology has enabled, it's a force multiplier. So now if you get people connected to the right things, it's like you can unleash creativity, you can unleash like new invention, innovation in ways that you couldn't do before. Tying this back to what you're working on, do you think, what do you see as some opportunity spaces in the next couple years? Some of the major areas that if you were, let's say, um, an analyst, or if you were using one of your products that you've helped create, one of your AI models, what are some of the major opportunities that you see in the immediate future, use cases of how someone could take it and run with it?
Yes, so there are a lot of applications for AI models, as we know. I believe models aligned to those figures can help advance research. So, say an academic can continue to do a deep dive on researching a figure. Government analysts could use this for planning purposes, could improve diplomacy. So, if they are modeling and trying to anticipate countries' behavior, they could have a series of queries and see how the model responds to that. And that can strengthen or test their approaches. So one of the challenges that we all have is we make assumptions. I know I make assumptions all the time. You probably do as well, Ben. And these are fallible. And of course, technology is fallible as well. But this is a way for us to get our assumptions on paper, evaluate those, and have a model query and see what those responses are. And then you can, of course, have multiple rounds, multiple interactions to see what that looks like. You can also consider this in the conflict domain. You could see how a figure would respond to threats. You could see how a figure would respond in different types of conflict scenarios, specifically outlining how much commitment they have behind various initiatives or where their interests lie. So again, countries are pretty overt in signaling that, in part as a deterrent, right? So they're not opaque usually in their policies. They're very specific. So those are two examples of AI utilization. This can also, of course, be strengthened by OSINT retrieval, as well as internal retrieval of documents that will improve model performance, as well as be a resource for validation and what a researcher can go back to and learn even more with deep dives. So you can really get into the minutia of questions and everything that, of course, all analysts enjoy engaging in. I also think that AI models, and specifically language models, are going to be important for deepfake detection. And the reason I say that is we are spending a lot of time asking important questions about deepfake, asking ethical and legal questions and everything, and those are all going to be important. But imagine an adversary or a world leader that we're not certain if the content is fake, and the imagery could be very persuasive. The tonality could be very persuasive. But what would be the greatest variation is actually the language being used. Um, they would be characterizing it and talking about relations in a way that they haven't talked about them before. That would be the greatest deviation for a deep fake. So an AI model would be able to emulate that conversation, and we could see the variation between what is said from that possible deep fake to what the model says would be, as well as analysts scrutinizing, and they would be able to tease out all the nuances and variations in those conversations and have a better conclusion if it's a deep fake than based on specific verbal cues or imagery signals. So I think that language is actually going to be still important. I guess that makes me quirky about language and fascinated with it. But that is the area where I think it would be the greatest deviation point, and therefore the best way to detect.
I've never considered that before, but I could completely see how that would help in that process because I think so much of the technology with deepfake detection is focused on like pixel or other irregularities in terms of the video. And I think that as deepfake technology improves, that's going to be harder and harder to rely on as a counter deepfake technology or counter deepfake methodology.
Mhm.
So I think that yeah, in terms of language used, I would be really curious to see like if you have this AI model that can pretty accurately predict or capture the way in which a leader speaks, the way in which a leader responds, the consistent rhetoric, the consistent language used, the verbal, even things like the verbal tics, even the habitual statements that everybody has. If you see something that deviates significantly from that, that could be a real like tip that could cue you in on hey maybe this isn't genuine, regardless of how realistic it may look.
Right. The, that's what's the deceptive part is it is going to look real. So
Right.
what are the other components that are harder to deceive us about? And I think that's going to be an important component to that. I think you are right. People will need to continue to evaluate pixels and evaluate other parts of content, but I do think that there's more likelihood that that will evolve in that direction to have that approximation. But they will always, if there's an escalation or a threat or use of a deep fake, which I would assume would be one of the primary purposes, it would be a deviation in their behavior and what they say. Um, So I think it would at least be an opportunity to evaluate from that. This be part of the toolkit, as well as people's just raw intelligence and insights and instincts. So my father has a history in radio broadcasting and news, and he and I can always tell if something's been edited. It's just a pattern of the response is a little off
Sure.
from natural conversation or certain sounds that you hear that that's a deviation, and definitely that's an example of that as well. Um, so everyone has their own experiences and insights that can layer on that, but I do think technology will help counter that approach, as well as just being a research tool, which I think is going to be the primary application of this. And I think more and more specialized models are going to proliferate throughout the research ecosystem for this, and you can model countries when looking at their own behavior and set the models in motion and see how they interact with each other. So how's Russia and China negotiating behind the scenes? How is China interacting with, say, North Korea or India and Pakistan, as you mentioned earlier about their standoff? There's a lot of opportunities to push us to have an additional tool with the already robust toolkit and insights that people have with that. In addition to that, if I can riff on this for a minute, I also think that
Sure.
it gives us a great opportunity to evaluate the cognitive biases and frameworks that specific figures have, um, and see how that is molded into their thinking. So today, are they risk averse? Are they have a tendency to focus on certain variables more than other variables, and so forth? And I think that this would help illuminate those, as well as the cognitive patterns that we ourselves are using. So the types of questions that I ask and so forth. This can help identify those um, patterns and sometimes our limitations and an opportunity to improve those so that there can be a related side to basically help us improve our own thinking and provide checks on those approaches. So if as a researcher I'm interacting with a model, maybe there's a tangential AI that's running that says, hey, you're always asking about this. You're always focusing in this pessimistic way, or maybe you're not accounting for the variable. This can help us really make sure we're thinking completely. I think that that's just one example of basically having an agent running in parallel with your own work that I think will be very productive in this space.
I think that's extremely productive. I also think that you hear a lot about the quantitative benefits that AI and AI models can provide, the aid that it can provide in things like, coding, in data analysis. Obviously, AI is going to transform technology. It already has in many ways, but I think what you're describing is it shows the qualitative analysis power of AI and how if you incorporate behavioral analysis and other things that are real sciences but are heavily observation based and established things that have been going on for many years, I think that we can unlock see a different side of AI models that enable analysts and people to not just look at data in a better way or look at numbers or information or sensors in a better way, but actually look at behavior and personality and patterns in all of that, and then be able to draw insights from it and then improve their own work based off of those insights. So I think that's super exciting, and I haven't seen a lot out there that really focuses on that specific use case, which I think is fascinating.
So there is a firm out there I spoke with at Soft Week specifically that is looking at cognitive behavioral type patterns with specialists that guide that. So we are seeing people in this space. It's not surprising. It's a rich idea, and I think it'll be really productive. Of course, in the national security space, but just across the board, it'll be very insightful and helpful in those regards. So, yeah, I do think that until we reach some just high plateau of model performance, we will continue to build specialized models. It's possible that even at that plateau, that we will still have these specialized models, either because of internal data, closed networks, or just general performance reasons, will continue.
Yeah. No, Kevin, thank you. I'm gonna wrap up, try to land this plane here. This podcast has been really one of my favorite things. I have enjoyed speaking with you a lot today about this. There's a lot more conversation to be had about this because I definitely want to hear more about this idea. But for anyone who's wondering, where can they find more information about what it is you're working on, or how can they connect with you?
Sure, you can email me at Kevin Modlin. My last name is Modlin at modlinglobalanalysis.com. I'd be glad to continue the conversation. And I always enjoy our riffing, Benjamin. We're always poking at ideas and thinking about what's next and pushing us to think harder. It's always fun to talk with you, and really just good to do this. And thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for being a great guest. Looking forward to the conversation in the future and where it goes. To everyone who's listened, thanks for listening to Navigating Imbalance. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on YouTube, the Three Gimbals channel on YouTube. So subscribe to that first of all if you haven't already. We have our long form. You could listen to our full podcast in video there, or you can listen to our short snippets. We've been really putting out some pretty cool stuff with YouTube Shorts. So, if you only have a couple minutes and you're looking for some interesting insight, check that out. So YouTube, Spotify. Also follow us on LinkedIn if you haven't already. We have our own podcast page. That's Navigating In Balance, podcast by Three Gimbals. With that said, guys, thank you very much. Kevin, thank you so much for the conversation, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.